Hello and welcome to the fifth video of this legal research course. We're going to learn about using online research tools to find both primary and secondary sources. And yes, once again, we are going to learn using an exercise. This time, we will learn by researching into the issue of water pollution in India, specifically the pollution of rivers by industrial activity. Your task is to look into the legal and regulatory system for the protection of rivers in India and the penalties that may apply to polluters. Imagine you know nothing at all about the law in this area. What's the first step? As always, we have to start broadly in coming up with some keywords. Let's list a few of them. My list of keywords would be environment, water, pollution, India, Ganga, penalty, river, law, and industrial. These are broad enough to begin our research with, don't you think? Now, and especially because we have no prior knowledge of this area, we should start with some secondary sources. Secondary sources, as we have learned previously, will help us get acquainted with an area and help us identify the relevant primary sources. Offline, this would mean that we start by picking up a basic textbook on environmental law, or perhaps one that is focused on water pollution. Online, the equivalent of a textbook would be a website that is focused on environmental law. And unless you know of such a website, you should start with a general search on a search engine. So your first port of call for secondary sources online would be a search engine such as Google. Enter the general search terms into Google. Try them in different combinations. For example, you could try water pollution law in India or environmental law India. As you know, it's always better to start with the broader keywords before you move to the narrower ones, such as water pollution penalty or Ganga river pollution law. Now remember that some of the best content on the internet is now in video form. So don't forget to click on the Videos tab in your search results to browse through the videos. Also, if you see that a search result is worth checking out, always open the link in a new tab. That will help you remain on track on the original search. And don't forget to make a note of these sources. If you find any website or web page or video useful, make a habit of copying the links and pasting them to a document along with a note of any important details that you may later need to properly reference them in your work. So browse the websites and watch the videos. Remember that your goal at this stage is to make sure that your research has a firm foundation in a good general understanding of the area. Don't focus too much on the very specific material. Our suggestion is that you save them for later and go back to them once you know all the primary sources on the area. You can use the bookmark tool on your web browser to save and file web pages so that you can access them later. One of your main objectives at this stage is to get to know all the primary sources of law that apply to this area. So if you come across the names of any legislations or any cases, please keep a note of them. After browsing these secondary sources in the search engine results, you are likely to have come across some important concepts and principles from this area of law and the names of at least two central laws: the Environment Protection Act 1986 and the Water Prevention and Control of Pollution Act 1974. But before you go into the text of those statutes, you need to make sure that there are no other laws that you are missing out on. Again, it will help to take a broad approach even when we look into primary sources. It would help to look for a listing of statutes related to the environment. Can we find a website that lists legislation by subject area? We are familiar with a few free websites such as Vakil Number 1 and Nyay, and among the websites that provide such services for a fee, there is Manupatra. These websites have sections listing all the legislation related to the environment. You can read the titles of those statutes to see if any of them are relevant. And if the titles indicate any relevance, go to the text of these statutes and browse through the table of contents to see if they are relevant. So in this way, you can prepare a list of legislation that are relevant to the issue of water pollution in India. This is also a good opportunity to see the secondary legislation, that is rules, circulars and notifications on the subject. Most of the relevant secondary legislation would have been created under one of the statutes that we have already identified. Some websites, Manupatra for example, offer the facility of seeing the list of notifications and rules that have been created under a statute. We can take the same approach here to figure out whether something is relevant. Rely on the names of these statutes and their table of contents. Another tool you can use for figuring out that the statutes that apply to the area of your research is the website of the government agency or ministry that deals with this area. Again, from your preliminary reading of secondary resources, you would have figured out that the government agency that is primarily responsible for regulating pollution is the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change. That website, in fact, has a section that is devoted to the statutes, rules, regulations, and notifications that apply to the area of water pollution. Not every government website will be this helpful. Next, you want to find some case law on the area of water pollution. Once again, the approach you need to take here is to start with the broadest keyword in any of the case law databases. You could do a search on Manupatra. You can see that we restricted the search to the case note or the head note of a judgment as it's known among publishers of print journals. Your search results are likely to be more relevant. You could also do a search on Indian Qanun, which is a free alternative to Manupatra. Here, by restricting the search to Supreme Court judgments, we are looking for the most important cases in the area. When you are doing research of a very general nature, it is very important to not drown in a sea of judgments. That's a real risk while researching online. Your search results can number in the thousands, and a lot of those results may not be the most relevant. Your objective is to find the most relevant and important cases in the area. That's why it may be a good idea to start by restricting the search to Supreme Court judgments or by looking for cases where the relevant keywords appear in the head note itself. And then later, if you don't find anything that is relevant for your research, relax those conditions to get a larger number of results. Now, another online tool that you can use at this stage is the index feature that is available on some websites. You already know from what you have learned previously in this course about how to identify the provisions of a legislation that are relevant for your research task. So if at this stage of your research, you are already able to identify the most relevant provisions, then it's a good idea to look also at the cases that have been indexed under that provision. Suppose here that Section 42 of the Water Prevention and Control of Pollution Act 1974, which has the title Penalty for Certain Acts, is a relevant provision for your research. Offline, you would look at the AIR manual that is published by the All India Reporter or a similar publication. Online, however, there is a very useful feature that is available on Manupatra, where you can see the cases decided in relation to Section 42 grouped, as you can see on the screen, under the various courts. Indian Qanun also has a similar feature, which can pull out for you all the documents in its database that cite Section 42. So if you are clear about the most important statutory provisions, this tool may be very useful in figuring out a list of judgments that are most relevant for your research. By now, we expect that you would have a good grasp of the important primary sources of law on the issue of water pollution. You know what legislation is applicable, including perhaps even the subordinate legislation. You may also know the important judgments that are relevant for your research. And your preliminary reading of secondary sources may even have thrown up some new keywords. Terms such as Pollution Control Board, Effluent, and Ganga Action Plan. What next? The next step, as you know, is to go back to your secondary sources for more focused reading. You may remember that I had asked you to bookmark some of the specific secondary sources so that you could go back to them later. Return to them now. With the understanding you now have from reading the primary sources, you can now see if they were relevant and either read them or discard them. You can also do new searches with the new keywords. You can also try a Google search using the names of the cases and the important legislative provisions that you had identified to see whether there are articles that discuss them or news items that report on them. You can also move away from a general search engine such as Google to more specialized websites that publish articles and news that may be more relevant. So websites such as that of the Economic and Political Weekly, where you may need to pay for an account, or Frontline, or Indian Express, may lead you to news and opinion that can be quite relevant to your research. For articles of a more academic nature, you could look at websites such as SSRN, the Social Science Research Network, which is a free resource, or JSTOR. With more focused reading from material available on such sources, you can put the finishing touches to your research. Now, I don't think that I need to especially warn you about the credibility of online sources, but it needs to be said. While research has become easier because of the internet, the danger of inaccurate research has also increased. So bring a critical eye to material that you have found on online sources. This certainly applies to secondary sources. So if you have come across a website that you haven't visited before, please take a few minutes to cross-check the information on that website with another source. And similarly with primary sources, sometimes there is no way of knowing when a website was last updated. So make sure you check whether the legislation you are referring to is its latest version that has incorporated all amendments. We hope you've picked up some important tools and tips for conducting your online research from this video. Remember, there is no special magic to online research. The difference between a library and the internet is only the sheer magnitude of information available on the internet. It's often easier to do online research, but we should not get carried away by this convenience and lose track of methods of research that work very well in a library. We would still recommend that you take the same steps. Try to first get a broad understanding of the area of law using general secondary sources, identify the key pieces of legislation and the important case law that operate in the area, and then do more focused reading from secondary sources. Thank you for watching.